Hello. I thought I'd run through a little process that I've been working on here. I want to explain, maybe show you how to control some slides in ProPresenter using MIDI through Ableton Live. It's really simple. It can be complicated if you don't understand how MIDI works, but maybe this will give you some insight. There's a few things that you need to set up on your computer first before you can actually do this. And keep in mind this is being run on a Mac, so I do not know the process for the PC at this point. But the first thing I want to do is make sure that I can open up Audio MIDI Setup. And you can find that in the from the Spotlight or in your application utilities. But once I've got it open, what I need to do is go up here to Window and show the MIDI Studio. And I want to make sure, because what I'm doing right now is I'm going to be controlling ProPresenter from Ableton Live on the same computer. So it's going to be an inter-application connection. It's not going to be a network session. If I was using another computer on the network, I would use a network session to do this. And the difference is here. This is the network session, and this is the IAC driver, inter-application communication. So what I want to do is double-click the IAC driver and make sure that it's active. I'm going to create a port. We'll just let it default to IAC bus 1, and I want to make sure that the device is online. And once that's the case, I can close this, and now I have an IAC driver. It's no longer grayed out. So we can see everything's working. Okay? Basically what this does is it gives each application that uses MIDI an input and output port that sends a signal to the internal computer, and then anything that's listening to that signal will hear it and utilize that. So here's the next step. Let's set up ProPresenter to receive that information. So in ProPresenter, if you have the MIDI communications module, then you'll be able to do this. If you don't, you need it. If you're on the trial, you can activate the trial, all of the modules for the trial, but in order to use this in a production environment, you'll need the communications module. So I've cleared this out. I'm going to make a new MIDI device, so add MIDI device, and it's going to be labeled MIDI, core MIDI device, behavior is a device, and the source is now IAC bus 1. This doesn't appear until you set it up. If this isn't here, then you need to go set it up in your MIDI configuration, Audio MIDI Setup. So what we'll do is click the checkbox here, which says that, hey, ProPresenter, please listen to this, this MIDI bus. And I'll save it, and I'll go ahead and connect. Now I'm connected to it, and ProPresenter is listening to it. In Ableton Live, I'll open up a new set in Ableton Live, and I'll show you what we need to do there. Under Live Preferences, you'll need to make sure that under Link MIDI that you have an input and output for IAC driver. Now you'll want to set track on and remote on for the output. The input isn't as significant because we're not going to be telling Ableton to do anything with an IAC driver. If you happen to need that, then you would want to turn track and remote on for the input of the IAC driver as well. You have to be careful when you mix the input and output of the IAC driver with multiple applications that you're using explicit channels to send data across, because all applications listen to all channels of the IAC driver unless you tell it specifically what channel to be transmitting and sending on, or transmitting and receiving on. So at this point, I've got Ableton set up correctly, and now I should be able to, in any given track, select the IAC driver, and it will remotely control whatever application is listening. And we can see that in this first MIDI track here. Since we're going to be generating triggers with clips and not with an external instrument, we don't need MIDI input. So I can turn the MIDI input off. From here, I want to change the MIDI output to IAC driver, and arbitrarily I'll choose, say, channel 15. Okay? And so now, anything that's produced inside this track, any MIDI note, is going to be sent through the channel and out to the IAC driver on channel 15. Now there's another tool that you'll need in order to monitor your MIDI to make sure it's working correctly, and that's called MIDI Monitor, and that's right here. You'll probably need to download this, and once you have it installed and set up, there's not much to it other than opening it, you'll want to make sure that your sources are set correctly so you're not seeing all kinds of garbage. So under your MIDI sources, check off the bus that you're going to be listening to, and you're pretty much set as far as that's concerned. Let's see if there's anything else. Oh, under Filter, you might want to turn off Clock. and I'll show you why. When I start this timeline in Ableton, it starts sending, well, it's not sending, good. Okay, we're not getting the data that we don't want, so that's a good thing. So from here, what I've got now is a track in Ableton that could transmit MIDI data to the IAC driver, and we've got ProPresenter set up to listen to MIDI data on the IAC driver. And so I just want to test to make sure that Ableton is actually sending data out. So I'm going to create a clip here, and I'll turn monitoring on, and we'll hit this button here. This is a C4, and you can note that in the MIDI monitor, you see C4 is being triggered. Now, when I manually click it, it's being triggered at a velocity of 106 for the on and a velocity of 64 for the off. Oftentimes 64 is considered off because it's halfway between 0 and 127. So what I can do here is I can add a note, and then I can loop this clip and start it. So this clip will start to play, and it will loop, and every time that note hits, it registers on the IAC bus as a C4 at 100 on channel 15. Now if I go over to ProPresenter and I look at the MIDI setup under Preferences, Communications MIDI setup, I'm going to see here that the last note that I received was 72 with intensity 100. This number 72 is arbitrary. It's actually mapped by these numbers here. And so it's in incremental order. So 72 is all the way up to, what note did we say? C4. So C4 is 72 notes up the keyboard, basically. And you'll notice that because we're sending from Ableton at a velocity of 100, that the intensity, velocity and intensity, two different words for both programs, is being received by ProPresenter at 100. This is important because in the index functions, you can determine which slide you want, or video, or playlist item, by the velocity you send from Ableton. So you can reserve a single note to send multiple velocities to ProPresenter to switch between specific slides. Okay, so let's jump back to, let's see, where do I want to go here? What do I want to do? So the goal here is to use Ableton Live to pull up these 4 different slides. I've got a document here called test document, and it's got a 1, 2, 3, and a 4 on it. Let me turn the output off on the stage. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And I want to be able to automatically select those. So what I'll do in Ableton Live is I will make sure that, first thing I need to know is what triggers 1, 2, 3, and 4 in ProPresenter. And we find that under Preferences, Communications, and again, MIDI Setup. So down here in the Select by Index, you'll see that to trigger a slide, you want number 19. Well, number 19 happens to be G-1. So if we play a G-1 note, we're going to go to the slide that matches the velocity that we play on that note. And you could play it on a keyboard, or you could program it into a clip. And so what we'll do here is, I'll go ahead and delete this, and let's go find a G-1. Here's a G-1 right there. All right, so now I've got a G-1, and if I expand the velocity up here, you'll notice that this is being sent at 100, and that matches this little dot right here. This is your automation. So this little dot is set to 100, and you can see right there, I'll hover over it again, but right there, there's a little indicator that comes up and it shows you that it's running at 100. If you bring this down, you drop that all the way down to 1. Now what's happening is, you'll notice over here that the G1 is being sent with a velocity of 1. Well, in terms of ProPresenter, if you look at the preferences, you can see now that the last note it received was 19. 19 lines up with G1, so we know we're good there. And the intensity is 1. So it's telling ProPresenter that for the current document, which is test in the Ableton Live playlist, or whatever your playlist is, for that current document, when it receives a note velocity on G1 of 1, it will trigger slide 1. So we can trigger slide 2 with a velocity of 2, slide 3 with a velocity of 3, etc. right? So if we go to Ableton and we were to put in another note, now we've got two notes going, and you can see they're both triggering, except that one is at a velocity of 100. So we've got the first one at 1, the second one at 100. So let's bring this velocity down, and we'll bring it down to 2. Okay? Now, the reason I made this video in the first place was because I was running into a problem with the velocities here in the way I was setting it up. And I'll show you a little bit later what I'm talking about. But for this example, you can see that G1 is playing 2 times. The first time it plays at velocity 1, the second time it plays at velocity 2, and you can confirm that as they rotate back and forth here. And just because I want to do this, let's move this over to the second beat, and let's duplicate these. I'm going to option drag, and then I'm going to set this velocity to 3, and I'm going to set this velocity to 4. Okay, so now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can see down here 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, if you switch back to ProPresenter, you can see that as they're triggered, the slides are moving, and as a result, your video is changing. So these 4 instances of the same note allow you to select a specific numbered slide up to 127, because that's the limit on the velocity scale per document. Now here's the problem that I ran into, and it's a little bit confusing here because it takes a little bit of fine-grained tuning to get this to work the way you want it to. There's a lot of little clicking and dragging, and it can be tedious, it can take some time, and there's really no indication of what slide's being loaded. I haven't the slightest idea. I really don't know unless I pre-program it and I just make a note to myself that this one's done. Don't touch it, don't change it, or it'll screw up the order. Because if you change the arrangement order for a given song, it's not going to match up. So this particular pattern is going to have to match your arrangement in ProPresenter. So what I thought I would do is we'll jump into a feature in Ableton Live that allows you to filter out specific aspects of MIDI for a given note. So we leave these settings the same, but what I want to do is come over here to MIDI effects, and I want to grab a MIDI effect rack and drag it onto the track. Okay. Now down here I want to turn on the show hide chain list, and right here in the drop MIDI effects I'm going to create a chain, and I'm going to name that chain intro. Okay, and I want my intro slide to be slide 1 of every song. Some may be different, but for the most part that's what it's going to be. So intro is going to be slide 1. So what I'll do is I'll limit what can come through this. Now I'll show you here, if we put our note back in to G4, G minus 4, where'd you go? G minus 1, or G minus 1. Okay, so, and I'll click the play. So what we have here is a signal going through every time it's triggered. And if I double click the header here, I can look at my chain. Now you can see the MIDI signal starts in origin, the origin is here. And as it's playing, it's sending that signal down the channel. You can see because it's unmuted that you can, the signal is going through. It's going into this section right here. And you can also see it right there. You can see it here and here. That means that the signal is successfully going through and it's making it out to the IAC bus driver. Right here, you can see that. Okay, but what if I played a different velocity and I didn't want it to affect the intro? That's okay, I can change this. So if I set my note back here, if I set the velocity back to 1 because I want the intro to be on 1, okay, and then I go back to my device here, I'm still getting that signal. Now I'll show you here, if you click on the velocity button, you have a range of velocities that are valid. And you can see that because the note is being triggered at 1, that a little light shows up here right on the 1. If we change the velocity to 8, it would be blinking right here. So what we can do is limit where that signal goes. And we can do that by adjusting the size of this. This is basically a filter. Now I can move this anywhere along here. And if I were to place it right here, what I'm telling Ableton is don't do anything. Don't allow this signal to pass from here to here unless the velocity is 2. So we move to 1, we can see, sure enough, we get a signal. It's going through. But here, we are not getting a signal. It's not leaving the system. It's not showing up down here. But when we switch to 1, no problem. We're getting a good signal. So we can do intro. We can duplicate this and make a new chain and call it verse 1. And then we can move this to 2. And let's say that 2 is going to put the slide on verse 1. The first slide of verse 1. Now what if the intro is 3 slides long? Okay, let's say that it is. Then we want the verse 1 to come in on slide 5, or 4, slide 4. So we would set this to 4, right? And up in the MIDI, up in the notes, we would create another note somewhere in line with the song and its timing, and we would set the velocity to 4, right? So now we look at this and we see that there's 2 notes firing. One's firing at 1 and one's firing at 4. And you can see that the meter here switches back and forth. If we put the selection auto select on, we can see it just switch back and forth. Auto select basically selects all the devices that are attached to that chain when it's triggered. It's not critical in this instance. So the other thing that we can do is we can limit the key. So if we don't want any other keys to affect this, we can just dial this down and say, you know what, this MIDI effect rack is going to be dedicated to G1, which is designed in ProPresenter to only pull up the index of the slide of a particular document while it's being played. So now we've limited to that. There's no risk of hitting any other buttons and having any other MIDI data go through. And the velocities have been throttled down to 1 and 4. And you can see down here the problem. Ableton Live seems to have a bug, and I can't figure out what's going on. If you've run into this, let me know if you've solved it, because I can't solve it at this point. I've come up with a workaround, but this is driving me insane. We've got this one in 1, and we've got this one in 4. And you remember, we set the velocity of that second note to 4. It's not set to 3, but we're getting a 3 velocity being sent, and as a result, ProPresenter is going back between 1 and 3, 1 and 3, okay? And so I don't want that. I want it to go between 1 and 4, but I haven't been able to figure out why it's doing this. So one hack that I've been able to figure out that works is the following. If intro is on 1, I'm going to make this filter cover 1 and 2, okay? So I'm still getting 1, 3, 1, 3. And now I want to change the verse to be active on velocity 3. So that'll be slide 3. And so you can note, you can see here that 1 and 3, 1 and 3 are going. The problem with this is that it limits me to odd number slides. And that really poses a challenge. If we have slide 2 and we need to go to slide 2, we can't. We can only go to slide 3. So that means maybe having to put a blank dummy slide between the two in order for it to show up correctly, or potentially spreading out, spreading these across a bigger range. So let's see if we do 1 and we change the verse to 8. And we'll see what happens. 1, 1, 1, 1. Yeah, it's not making any sense. Yeah, it's triggering 8, but it's sending a value of 1. If I expand this one more over, now it sends the value of 8. Now I can't figure out why it's doing that, but that's the solution. So the problem with this, of course, is that we have no slide 8. We need a slide 8 in order to do that. So we would have to add dummy slides in between, and now it's going to go between 1 and 8. So at this point, I have not figured out how I can get this to filter between 1 and 2. Okay, so why is this a problem? It's really not a huge problem if I program the song right, but if I right-click the chain selector here and if I right-click this and say Show Names in MIDI Editor, I'm going to get a little bit friendlier display here. I can fold this up and it's going to show intro, verse, and so every note here shows that it's intro, verse, and what I could do so that I could notate is in my chains I could say intro is slide 1 and verse is slide 2, etc. And when I see this, I'm going to see that here. Intro 1, verse 1, 2, and that would give me the ability to quickly reference, okay, I want to do verse 1, then I need to bring this up to 2. And that gives me a quick reference so that I don't have to remember. Otherwise, I'd be going back and forth between this and going, oh, okay, the verse is here. Let's see. New group, verse 1, and this is group label intro. And so we'll name this, let's say, none. Okay, so we got intro and verse 1. It's slide 1 and 2. I'd be going back and forth between those two to reference which numbered slide I need to do. And that's really not that big of a deal, but this was the problem that I ran into. Other than that, if you understand that without the MIDI Effect Rack, you can simply draw in your values here and they'll work. You can see it's working now. Something about the MIDI rack screws it up. That you can control the numbered slide in a given document in ProPresenter simply by adjusting the velocity of a single note. If this helped you, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, let me know if you have any questions, and also let me know if you can figure out that problem with the filter on the MIDI rack. Anyway, I'm out. Thanks for watching.